So, okay, I think that we can start. So, naším hostem tedy odpoledním bude profesor Hans Renes, který je emeritním profesorem univerzity v Utrechtu a Freie Universität Amsterdam. Dlouhodobě vlastně se zabývá problematikou kromě kulturní krajiny s důrazem na zemědělskou krajinu a potom tedy problematikou kulturního dědictví. So our today's guest for the invited lecture is Johannes Renes, who is a member of the University of Utrecht and the Freie Universiteit Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and his focus is on long-term research in landscape and heritage studies, and he will speak about the topic of heritage of the European landscape transformations. So Hans, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zenek. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
I will talk in English. I don't speak Czech. My name is Hans Renes, and I was trained as a historical geographer and as a rural planner. But I spent most of my career in research in historic landscapes, but ended up as a professor in heritage studies in Amsterdam. I retired from that position last year because I had to, because of my age. Now, heritage is about the use of history in the present. And in my presentation, I will try to connect the past with the present and even a bit with the future, with a focus on historic landscapes on a European scale. I will start with some definitions, then I will look at the relation between landscape and identities, and then I will have a further look at landscape transformations to conclude with a few remarks on possible roles for landscapes in future challenges we have in our society. Now, my starting point is the definition of the European Landscape Convention, Florence 2000, that describes landscape as an area as perceived by people whose character is the result of the action and interaction of natural and/or human factors. This is a very interesting definition. It's important because it may be the first time in history that the definition of the term landscape found almost general acceptance. But also the convention and also its definition was the starting point for Europe-wide discussions on landscape. Before that, landscape was much more a Northwestern European topic. And in many parts of Eastern Europe, landscape was more seen in relation to landscape ecology, so more from the natural side. But now, after this European Landscape Convention, there is a certain agreement growing on what landscape can be and how we can do research in it. And then further, this definition includes centuries of discussion on landscape. The original meaning of the word landscape in Northwestern Europe was region. In the German language, Landschaft, but also there was an Anglo-Saxon word Landskip in the early Middle Ages, and there's the Dutch word Landschap. They were all used to describe regions. Then in the late Middle Ages, pictures of the environment were known as landscapes, particularly by painters from the Low Countries. And then the painted object itself became known as landscape. I already said there was an English word, an Anglo-Saxon word, landscape, but that disappeared somewhere in the early Middle Ages. And the word landscape in English was reintroduced by Dutch painters. That means that when you talk to different people about landscape, they might mean different things. In German, it's still more or less the regional meaning. And also in Scandinavia, a Swedish province is still called the landskap. On the other hand, in the English literature, it's usually very much an aesthetic idea coming from this landscape painting. But on the other hand, all these meanings are always related to perception and with human activities. Landscape is etymologically also related to shaping the land. And therefore it has a meaning of control. So it's very much a man-made word that describes the man-made environment. You can see this in a number of European languages. The French word paysage is more or less the visual idea, because beside that, the French use the word pays for region. But, and in the Slavonic languages, I'm not quite sure, but I think, as far as I know, the word krajina is also originally had the meaning of a region, but now, as you see in this book, which I bought in Czechia a few years ago, also stands for the visual aspect of our environment. So there is a kind of coming together of different definitions and ideas of landscape. This aesthetic aspect of landscape is also popular for a long time. Perhaps tourism started in its modern way in the British Isles. We see here a landscape is tourist, still not quite a lot of them, still distinguished from the local population. They are outsiders and they look at the landscape mainly for aesthetic reasons. They are not very interested in what people are doing. They look at the mountains. And of course, tourism is one of the main uses of landscape. Landscape may be the main resource of tourism, and tourism in itself is the largest economic sector worldwide. It's not completely unproblematic, as this picture shows. There can be too many tourists, and you can also think of some of the major tourist towns in the world, Venice or even Amsterdam, that are a bit overrun and where the locals feel under threat nowadays. But landscape is also an aspect that involves people. It's a living space. And it's basis for people's connection to places and to their involvement in management and in the environment. It's good to realize that landscape also has a time dimension, and that when we look at landscapes and identities, there are developments in time and there are also regional differences. That landscape are important in national identities is shown in this series of stamps. I'm not a stamp collector myself, so I took some from the internet. But it's clear that very many countries, and there were hundreds of more examples, very many countries describe themselves in terms of their landscapes. It's their way of communication with the outside world. It's what they are proud of, it's what they're interested in, and what they think is essential in telling about themselves. We can see that also in 19th century, even earlier paintings. We can see that in music. A very well-known example that all of you know is, of course, My Fatherland from Smetana. And I collected a number of CD covers to show what this fatherland is. And you see that it's towns, but it's also rural landscapes of very different kinds. They are landscapes that are important to motivate people. And here are pictures from England from the First World War on the left, and also from the Second World War on the right. It shows the quintessential English landscape, particularly the picture on the left shows the the patchwork landscape with hedges and villages that most English people see as their essential English landscape. And it's a landscape, particularly from Southeast England and the home counties around London. They're also much more natural landscapes, but this is seen as the quintessential cultural landscape. And on the right, also a landscape is pasture, landscape with cathedrals, a Christian landscape. It's all what the English think of about themselves. And it's also, in all these posters say, it's worth fighting for. So this is what they see as the essential thing. In the Netherlands, we also have such an idea of the national myth of origin, which is the struggle against the water. I will return on that later. The land, the people that build themselves a home by conquering land from the sea. It's a rather difficult story when you really look at it. Much more things to say about it, but it's what we like to think of ourselves as being our essential habits, our essential identity. It's very different from Germany, for example, where they see the essential Germany in the forest. And here you see a number of posters that are sometimes quite old. Shows that even in the 19th century, this idea was already widespread. And of course, as every idea on identity, it was misused by the Nazis. And here you see some aspects too, where they see themselves as wandering through the forest in the following the prehistoric original Germans, whatever that may have been. Even during the Second World War, forests were protected by the Nazis as part of their essential landscapes. Well, a few other examples. Upper left, Sweden, also a country thinly populated that sees itself as a very natural country, and people like to retreat to the forest or the beach. On the other hand, Italy, which sees itself mainly as living in a cultural landscape, is a very old history in which the city of Rome is an essential point, but also the Tuscan landscapes of the Renaissance, also a period in which Italy was famous in the whole of Europe. And then, well, Switzerland, of course, which uses the Alps as their main identity builder. They see themselves also as protected by the Alps. And on the other hand, the Alps, the passes, the roads through the Alps are the basis of the independent country. It paid for their independence. And then down left, Yellowstone. And Yellowstone is again a very different story. Yellowstone is seen as purely natural. And again, this is not a neutral term. To take this example, so it's it's down right. I made a mistake, but that's Yellowstone. That's seen as pure nature, and also by Europeans often seen as the real nature as it should be. But that's of course untrue. It's a nature that's only made by evicting the original population. And it's even a genocidal landscape. And that's an interesting aspect. By seeing nature as their essential, they can get rid of a whole series of difficult discussions on the origins of the United States or Canada or many other colonial countries. This so-called Yellowstone model, in which you try to make real nature by evicting population. It's still very popular in Africa, where European trophy hunters are more welcome in national parks than the original population that are usually framed as poachers. So actively, these are systems of actively forgetting about the history. And that's not an easy process. The more you try, the more memories spring up every time again. That's essential for traumas. And of course, also in the United States, there are also the victims, the people who have been removed, who do everything they can to protect their memories. Before returning to this, I want to give some idea of long-term processes and historic transformations in the European landscape. And I will say a few things about chronology, about the European scale of landscape development. And that's an important point because so many people, and particularly amateur historians, are very interested in landscape, but see it only from their own local perspective. But every local landscape is also part of European or even global processes. And then I will show that many of these transformations made heavy changes in landscape. They made new landscapes and they made old landscapes extinct. But as I also hope to show, extinct landscapes are rarely completely extinct. Now, this is a map of European landscape types. And I'm not going to into much detail, but when we look at the northern half of Europe, there are in fact three main types of landscape. One is the landscape of open fields. That's the huge, open, visually open landscapes that were used for grain growing during the Middle Ages, and in most cases are still used for large-scale arable. Then another type, what you see in west of France, Ireland, many parts of England, parts of Scandinavia, northern Spain, are the so-called enclosed landscapes or bocage, often with dispersed settlement. And then a third type are in the brown color, linear settlements, older land or in forest. And they are the typical medieval reclamation landscapes. When you take these three as your basic equipment, you can explain most of the European landscape types, although there have been, of course, changes all over history. And these changes, they have a certain periodization. This picture comes from Central Europe, shows how in the early Middle Ages, around 650 on the left, the amount of arable was on an all-time low. After the Roman period, in Western Europe at least, population numbers fell drastically and the amount of arable was very small. The slow recovery in population during the Middle Ages until around 1300, until the first red line, is reflected in a gradual growth of the amount of arable that speeded up around the 10th century, but so did population size. Then between 1300 and the early 15th century, there was a huge crisis in which Europe may have lost a third of its population by epidemics, by hunger and other crises. That brought also a lowering of the percentage of arable. And in fact, you can see it as a change from arable into grassland and forest. It's a process in which perhaps 10,000 villages disappeared all over Europe. But you can mainly see it as a transformation of the landscape, a rebooting of the landscape. And after that, fluctuations went on, but never again so drastically over the continent as a whole. Now, this is the typical landscape of open fields, the large grainlands that reached their summit around 1300, when population pressure in Europe was so large that most people lived mainly from grain and forage. Very little meat, very little fish, basic food. In fact, perhaps a situation we will have in the future too. There are widespread speculations on how many people the world could feed, and the amount of meat that is being consumed is a large variable in these discussions. This picture shows Europe around 1300, and it shows how the large urbanized areas all have very intensive agriculture around them and have the large open field landscapes that provided their grain supply on a somewhat larger distance in general. This is a picture that needs some more work, but it's in general, it's not a bad idea, I think. These are the enclosed landscapes, and they are often seen as less modern, more self-supporting, but in fact that's not true. They are part of the same system in which the large open field landscape fed the urban population with grain, whereas these enclosed landscapes fed these same towns with animal products, for example, and with a multitude of other products. This very dense hedgerow landscape in the west of France, for example, only reached its summit in the early modern period because of the growth of the Paris population that needed dairy and meat products. The period of the High Middle Ages between the 10th and the early 14th century was also a period of expansion of the Northwest European population after centuries of stagnation during the early Middle Ages. And then you see migration movements, for example, from England into Ireland, from France into Spain after the reconquering of Spain from the Muslims, and then also movements of the Northwest European population overflow to East and Central Europe. And when you look at it on the picture upper right, when you look at it in more detail, what you can see is that the densely populated agrarian areas such as Bohemia were bypassed, and this colonization movement mainly focused on the mountainous areas that were still very thinly populated. And there you see this type of very planned settlements, these large strip fields and linear settlements, also often known as forest reclamations. And in fact, they have been very prominent in the mountains in the north and west and south of Bohemia, of Czechia. The lower picture is somewhere in Poland. The upper picture is in the Black Forest in Germany, but you know these settlements all. Then this crisis, I already said that perhaps some 10,000 villages were deserted during that period. And that's again a very regional story. In Germany and Scandinavia, there were many marginal regions that lost their population, and some of these mountainous areas, in fact, never recovered until the present day. The Black Forest was more densely populated in 1300 than it is now. England shows another picture. Here you see the majority of deserted villages exactly in the zone that was characterized by large villages and open fields around 1300. And here, the background is the transformation of these open field landscapes into pasture landscapes for sheep, for the growing textile industry. So it's an economic background, and in general, it's a bit later than this late medieval crisis. So it's again a complex pattern, but it shows the strong transformations and it shows extinct landscapes, in fact. Another aspect of this transformation was in some of the porous soils in Central Europe, the change from arable farming to fish farming. Here you see this pond landscape around Trebon. Well, you know more about it than I do, probably. These transformations also entered a new phase during the early modern period. And what you see on this picture, which I love very much, by a former German colleague, Hans Renes, who showed that there was a kind of European economic system developing from the 16th century onwards, in which the core region of Northwestern Europe led to changes all around, especially the Baltic Sea, in which large regions that were more or less self-supporting changed into grain exporting regions with large landed estates during the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. And you might say that in the period in which England lost most of its grain production, it moved this grain production to the Baltic Sea, to Poland and Lithuania, for example. Also part of European-wide movements was the raising of cattle in some of the mountainous areas in Eastern Europe or in Hungary or in Scandinavia or in Scotland. And then these animals were shipped or driven to the main markets in the Mediterranean and in Northwestern Europe. So landscape transformations were a European story already during the 16th century. And here's what happened in the Eastern Baltic, where in the same period that England lost most of its grain growing, new grain producing villages with three-field systems were planned in Belarusia and Lithuania. So, European movement. Already talked a bit about the areas in the bocage, the enclosed landscapes in Western France, for example. And you can see very clearly on this Google Earth photograph how many small areas with very small strip fields were enclosed and changed into pasture. These are the former arable fields of all these villages. You see it everywhere. And you can also see that this transformation was almost complete, but still left changes. Same is true in northern Germany, Schleswig-Holstein. That's the picture upper right, where you can also see the old arable fields reflected in the later enclosed pastures. Many changes still went on even in the 19th and 20th century. Here I have a picture of the 20th century population movements after the Second World War. Also a very Central European story, and you know everything about it. It shows how complete landscapes changed their population. And that's also a very interesting aspect, because complete landscapes were taken over by new populations that must at first not have recognized it as their landscapes, but they made it into their landscape. They felt they settled in it and made it their own. And perhaps now they see it as their own landscapes too. That's a very interesting aspect that has not really much researched. This is what went before that during the Second World War. This is an old map I once bought somewhere in Czechia, where all the old villages had new German names, a map from 1942. So it also means that names, place names, field names, are one of the main methods to make a landscape your own, to connect to a landscape. and also to disconnect an earlier population. Here a picture from the west of Czechia, where one of these villages was deserted. And again, you see how the villages remains visible for at least half a century, but probably much longer, as a kind of palimpsest. It's written over, but it's still recognizable. Landscape has a very long memory. But still, landscapes change and names change. And this is again an area in the region of Kaliningrad, where the names of villages were changed twice in a very short period. During the Nazi period, all these former Lithuanian names that were never seen as a problem were changed into German sounding names. And then a few years later, after the Red Army took over this area, all these names were changed again. And there's a famous book by Marion Deunhoff, a famous journalist, who fled this area in 1944 and who wrote this book, Names Nobody Uses Anymore. Complete landscapes have lost, more or less, with their names, their connection to an original population. But still, you know that original population, the older population, still feels a connection. They travel in touring cars now to the region. And of course, there are the very strong changes in landscapes by agricultural modernization, and perhaps the strongest by collectivization in Eastern Germany. Here you see the Czech-Austrian border with two landscapes that must have been very much alike before the 1950s and were then completely changed, to completely different routes. But again, there are many interesting stories to show that even these processes, and even these very drastic changes, are more complex. This is a former village in the north of Germany, northeast Germany. And you see a village, 1694, with 3 open fields. Then after this was taken over by a large landowner and was changed into a large grain producing estate. You see the estate village, still existing in 1900. Then after the communist takeover in 1946, the estate was divided among the farmers. But then after a few years, the communists decided that that was not their idea of communism. So they renationalized it again and made it into a collective farm that was in fact, very close to the landed estate. So perhaps not the story they wanted to tell, but they were very close to the large landowner. And nowadays, it's owned by a large farmer who runs the whole area as a private farm. So complex stories, but still also some continuity. And let's not forget, and that may be a less well-known story for you, collectivization in Eastern Germany had its counterparts in what I used to call the Christian Democrat landscapes of land consolidation in the West. This is in fact a landscape that is as drastically changed as a collective farm. It's nowadays one of the most boring landscapes in the country. And even here you see in the Google Earth picture that the old stream that has disappeared did not completely disappear. It's still recognizable. And even now there are plans to revive it, to redig it, to bring it back into the landscape. And then again, collectivization as well as land consolidation had its own geography. It was most drastic in the large arable region. It was less drastic in marginal regions that were more dependent on animal husbandry or mixed farming. And here is a village in the east of Germany where you still have this medieval forest clearing pattern that's now more or less preserved even. It's seen as one of the best examples, although there are much better examples in Poland and in West Germany. And even the landscape of collective farming is now a landscape that has disappeared. This is somewhere in the Baltic countries. And it shows that this is also something of the past, or something that is very slowly recognized as part of heritage. From the idea that heritage is not just what you want to preserve, it's also those parts of history you try to forget, but as still part of your history. And again, the more you try to forget it, the more it pops up every now and then. So you can better give it a place in your official memory. So extinct landscapes are rarely extinct. These are deserted settlements from the late Middle Ages in Germany. And what you can see is that people have given themselves a lot of effort to trace them, to find these traces, to document them, to do some archaeological excavation, and to tell this story. It means that this human history of an extinct landscape is very much part of what people are thinking now as important. It's the same with drowned villages in the northwestern part of the Netherlands. These drowned villages not only left a few remains, such as the old church tower, that's the only surviving building of a lost village, but also you can do archaeological research, you can trace them, and you can look for them, and people do that. They are interested in this history. Also because it may say something about the present challenges. At present, sea level rise is a major concern. And there's also nature conservation that wants to give lands back to the sea, as they say it, to rewild, to renature some of these agrarian landscapes. And the local population looks to the old stories of the medieval loss of land by the sea and then says this is not what we want. And downright a recent monument for drowned villages. It's very much a story that's alive, and that's even more alive than it has been for centuries. Here again, a church tower that's recently been reconstructed on the site of a drowned village. And here on the upper left, a church tower that has been preserved in a new made lake in Italy. And it refers, in fact, to medieval situations in which land was submerged, was drowned by sea floods, and the church towers remained visible in the water for a long time, sometimes for centuries. This area on the map, the 17th century map, 16th century map, is reclaimed later, and even one of the church towers was reused for the new church. Also in England, many lost villages, they are there since the early 20th century, also shown on topographical maps, which I find very interesting. It shows that these deserted lands, deserted villages, are seen as an important part of the regional story of this landscape. And I must say, one of the reasons is that they were so easily recognizable, at least in parts of central England, where the medieval arable villages were transformed into pasture, but never plowed again. So the traces of the former arable land is rich and furrow, but also the traces of the former houses and narrow roads are all still visible on this early photograph. Since England joined the European Union at least for a while in 1973, many of these areas have been plowed up because of the changing economy of farming within the EU. And it's also part of local stories and part of accidental happenings. This is an area in the central, in northeast England, where you see 6 medieval villages, and 2 are still there. 2 are deserted around 1500, and 2 are deserted in the end of the 17th century. It shows that this is a very complex story, and the main rationale behind it is that in the villages that disappeared, one farmer was able to buy the land of all its neighbors and then turn the whole village into a sheep farm. And where one farmer was, when no farmer was able to do that, the villages remained. So it's a complex story that says a lot about regional history. It also shows that the desertions, they may have been gradual, and perhaps not many people realized it, as some villages in the mountains in Italy or in Spain that are nowadays losing population, and where some villages only one farming family still remains, 80 years old at least, and then when they die, the village is deserted. So it's a gradual process. But in many other cases, it's also traumatic, and it tells stories about disasters in the past. This is a former church in Ireland of a village that was completely deserted after the potato crisis, when many people died and the rest was took the boat to the United States. Or the highland clearances from the middle of the 18th century and until the 19th century, where complete regions were depopulated by large landowners to use that land for sheep, and when that didn't work out, to use the land for hunting. And the whole Scottish landscape, which we like to see as nature, is a landscape full of ruins. And in fact, there are many people in the United States and in other parts of the country, Australia, who come from these regions and are interested in the history of these regions. And many locals, but also people from elsewhere, come there, visit the place, but also start archaeological research. There's a lot of citizen science going on here, and local museums that are being refurbished, as we see down left. So stories that touch people. And then a very recent example of a deserted place, Chernobyl, where you can see how nature again recovers, but again, it's still a landscape that's only partly nature and in which the human influence is still recognizable. Not to say it's still a dangerous place to go, although not all Russian soldiers have realized that, it seems. Now, then my last point, can lost landscape become a resource for the future? Well, in general, it's my opinion that landscape history can be a resource for the future. It can show us places that are important to protect or to develop, but it can also show us how things worked in the past. It can give us ideas. It can give us some material for comparisons. And there are the 2 main challenges on a world scale at the moment are climate change and the loss of biodiversity. Well, climate change brings enormous changes in the landscape. And the only way to get public support is to do that in a way in connection with the local population, but also by taking into account landscape values. Otherwise, you will have a lot of problems with locals. And in fact, the building of windmills is getting extremely difficult in densely populated countries nowadays, because just people don't want it, unless you try to involve them in the project and you discuss about the places where you do it. You You give them a share in the profits, and then you can get people on your side. And this is an example of a landscape in which solar panels are rather intelligently located, and then it's much easier. So take into account the landscape. The same is true with biodiversity, and there the discussion goes even a bit stronger about landscape. This is a stream in the northeastern part of the Netherlands, and you see the picture from 1902, a map that shows a stream with many bends, a very interesting, very rich landscape, although with a poor population. There's also things you have to take into account. Then in the middle, the landscape in the 1970s after agricultural improvement, a straight stream aimed at discharging, at draining the water, discharging it to the sea as soon as possible. But that no longer works. At the moment, many farmers have problems with drought, dry summers because of climate change. And then they need water to irrigate their lands. But that water is no longer there because it's all discharged. It's all brought to the sea by these very broad discharge channels. So we have to find ways to keep water for a longer time until we need it for agriculture, to store water. And one of the things you can do is that you make the stream longer again by re-excavating the old meanders. But then again, it's not enough. What you see here is a typical sectoral measure of water managers. And you see a stream that has a lot of bends, but it's everywhere has the same standard profile. It's everywhere as wide as well as they have learned at school, at the university. So in fact, it still discharges water much too fast. When you compare that with the original 1900 stream, that has a much more variety in its course. And another thing is that this new renatured stream is very much isolated from its environment. It's a stream and it's bordered by intensive agriculture, but it's not part of the local landscape. It's a nature reserve and that's it. So perhaps that's not the way to do it. Perhaps you must think not on the scale of a stream, but on the scale of a landscape. Try to find solutions involving the whole catchment area by storing water upstream, by bringing variety in the rest of the stream, by a whole set of measures to cope with many different aspects and results of climate change. In my opinion, there's too much emphasis on the building of so-called new nature, rewilding areas. And rewilding is, of course, a very important thing, to have a number of large areas in Europe that have the complete, as far as possible, a complete ecosystem with large predatory animals, etc. But during the last few years, we have worked intensively in the Netherlands, but also in other countries in Europe, in rewilding a number of areas. And these rewilding areas do function, but it's not enough. The whole loss of biodiversity is still going on. And you cannot cope with that by rewilding the whole of Europe, because in that case, there's no room for people. And we are still here and we want to stay here. The solution to the loss of biodiversity must be found, particularly in the agrarian landscapes. we will have to find ways of combining agriculture with biodiversity and also with landscape and with public support by the population. That's the main challenge for the future. Now, what's the role of heritage? Here's a picture I made of different ways of coping with heritage in a number of new building estates in the Netherlands. I'm not going into detail, but you can use heritage to preserve, just try to protect what's there. You can transform heritage as you use an old factory to make it into some new function, or you can be inspired. And you can also use heritage in isolation. You can see heritage as connected to its environment, and you can use it as part of integrated planning. I can show a bit of this with the example of castles. This is a number of castles in the Netherlands. Upper left was burned out some decades ago and was completely reconstructed. It's now as it used to be, as it was. Down left, that's inspiration. That's using the idea of castle to make new living environments for middle-class population who try to play golf. Upper middle is a castle that was built from straw to act as the background for exhibition and for artists. And it became immensely popular, but it only had a short life, but it still lives on in pictures and in memories. Down the middle is a completely newly built castle because it's a new town that didn't have any heritage, and they wanted heritage. They wanted to have a castle for marriage photographs and so on. So they tried to buy a castle somewhere in Poland, but they didn't succeed in that. So they decided to build one. And it was a complete failure. The builder went bankrupt, and it's now one of the most, one of the less interesting ruins in the country. It's built of concrete, so it doesn't age well, I must say. But well, no one knows what's happening. And then on the right, that's a lost landed estate, and that was rebuilt on its old foundations by an architect. Because he used the old foundations, he could not build a heavy building. He built it in wood, but it reflects the old building, and that's a kind of creative coping with history, and that's what's often more inspiring than just reconstructing or preserving. We have to think of all these possibilities. And we have to do something with our landscape. The landscape as it is now is lacking in variety, it's lacking in possibilities for use by the population. It's an agrarian steppe landscape. We have to do something to make the landscape useful again, to make it diverse again, and to improve biodiversity. And so there are ever more plans popping up for rebuilding hedgerow landscapes, not by reconstructing the old landscape, but by replanting hedges because they have a function in the new landscape. And on the other hand, we still have in Europe a number of areas that we have to cherish, in which we still can go on excursion and where we still can see how a varied landscape that we used to have a century ago can function, and perhaps that can give us ideas. So that's what I wanted to share with you. I don't know, Zenek, whether you have thought of any time for questions, but this was my presentation. I thank you for your attention.
Okay, Hans, so thank you for an interesting lecture full of inspiring examples, I must say. And now I think we have still short time for discussion. So if there are any comments or questions from participants here in the hall or also from a few participants online. Oh, perhaps I should propose my question. So you spoke a lot about the long-term transformations of the agricultural landscapes, and that's what we've discussed also today, the historical landscape structures and problems of its maintenance, and that those historical landscape structures were developed under different conditions than when compared to those that are prevailing today. So are there any principles that you would suggest how we should try to manage the historical landscape here in modern times? So it also has, because it has to also meet our new goals or fulfill our needs anyway.
Thank you for your question. It's difficult to give general guidelines for that. What I think is important is firstly, to look at the local situation, to do research into the history of an area before you take any measures. That sounds very familiar for most of us, but not for many others. That also means involving the population and their stories and their connection to the landscape. The second thing, that's more from professional background, I like to be able to recognize different phases in history. I see a landscape as layered and as a reflection of different developments during history. And I always get a bit sad when complete periods are wiped out by new measures. As also in a building, I like to see the building history reflected in the traces in the walls and in the windows, for example. Is that more or less an answer to your question?
Yes, maybe. Thank you. So still, I obviously tried to also make some time for others to develop their questions, or so still, if there are any. Well, if not, maybe so, because it's a long day for us today. So thank you very much that you were willing to join us today and to present your thoughts to us. And hopefully we will have also another opportunity to meet again at any other future event.
I look forward to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So goodbye.
Bye.